We are live, ma'am.
Okay. So a very good evening to all participants. On behalf of organizing committee, I welcome our resource person, Dr. Srividya Rajaram. She's here to present a topic on psycholinguistics. And let me take this privilege of introducing you to Dr. Srividya Rajaram is a practicing psychotherapist with a PhD from IIT Delhi, which she completed in 2020, and also MPhil in clinical psychology from Kasturba Medical College, Manipal. She has taught undergraduate and postgraduate psychology courses at the MIT Institute of Behavioral Health and Allied Sciences, Delhi, after which she worked with the Fortis Scott's Heart Institute as a clinical psychologist for 5 years. In her tenure there, she conducted trainings for companies in the area of stress management, work-life balance, wellness, and other related issues. She has also worked as a clinical psychologist with Adiva Hospitals, besides being a counselor with the National Law University. That was till 2020. Apart from her experience of 16 years with one-on-one psychotherapy, her corporate experience includes being a part-time counselor for EXL services and HCL technologies. She also worked as a consultant with School of Life, SOL, where she has facilitated numerous workshops on sexuality issues for teachers, parents, students, and others. As a part of SOL's activity, she also conducted workshops on prevention of sexual harassment and gender sensitivity in the workspaces. She is also associated with Inner Sight Counseling and Training Center as a counselor and trainer. Currently, she has private practice wherein she focuses on psychotherapy with individual clients. She is also working as a part-time counselor with the American Express Bank. She has also been giving webinars on topics such as supporting people through grief, mindfulness, and compassion. She has also partnered with Diversity Dialogues and conducted listening circles for organizations this past year. So welcome you, ma'am, here. Thank you so much for accepting our invite. And we are truly blessed to have you here. And we are really eagerly waiting to learn from you on this topic, which is comparatively new to us as psychologists.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shalini. It is very exciting to speak about one's own PhD work. I suppose it is very difficult to present 5 years of work in an hour's time, but I will try to do my best. And the lens through which I'm going to approach this after my discussion with you is to basically talk about a topic which is very close to my heart, which I researched, which is anger. But the tool that I used was one of specifically social linguistics. So as you can see that my thesis was entitled Anger Narratives, a qualitative approach to the psychosocial and linguistic aspects of the emotion of anger. So I hope that as we go further, we will understand, is psycholinguistics a tool that psychologists can use in their own research? So that's the purpose of this discussion today. And I'll also go ahead and discuss some of the pertinent findings specifically about anger as a phenomena. I'll keep the linguistic findings less because they're quite complex in nature and they would merit a discussion entirely. All right. So to begin with, first, I'd like to talk about the motivation for my research because this would be my third thesis. I've done a thesis master's, an MPhil, and a PhD. And all throughout, I've always somehow or the other been looking at anger as a phenomena. So it's a topic which is very close to my heart. So all my readings have shown me that anger is a very complex phenomena. There are many, many definitions of anger, thousands and thousands of definitions of anger. All of them are overlapping with various constructs. So this is not range, it's rage. So anger, as you can find, is interchangeably used with words like rage, frustration, hostility, and several such similar terms. And the interesting thing about anger is that it's one of those emotions that's been quantified over and over again, starting from the early 1900s to, the late 1900s. Like the number of tools that are available to measure anger is plentiful in nature. And I did a deep dive into this entire complex phenomenon of anger, and I understood a couple of things. Because what I wanted to make sense of is, what does a lay person like you and me, how do ordinary people who are not researchers, how do they look at anger, and what is the lens through which they look at anger? The fact that anger has been researched largely in conjunction with, so anger is highly correlated to coronary artery disease, coronary heart disease even now, and other such diseased phenomena. Anger as a standalone, it's harder to sort of like research. And of course, I've had my own personal challenges with the emotion, which I think as a researcher, it was necessary for me to bring this perspective into my thesis work. One of the things that really motivated me to do this piece of work was a movement with the publication of the DSM. Of course, of late, the DSM, where there was a movement towards trying to create a category of anger disorders, which I find a perplexing issue, because anger as such is a cultural phenomenon. So what I consider as maybe clinical anger in culture A may not be clinically angry in culture B. So then how do we go about creating a category of disorders of anger? And then from there on, we create treatment methodologies and medications. So the whole clinicalization of anger was a very perplexing phenomena for me, which all the more pushed me to try and understand anger from ground up, right? And the role of the cultural and linguistic practices are very crucial towards the study of any emotion. And we find that this is really not done with, this has not been studied with much rigor in emotion research. It is much easier to categorize an emotion into antecedents, consequences, behaviors, cognitions, and then research it. But to study it as in its raw form, as a whole, situated in the culture and the linguistic practices is something that's not being done as much as it should have been done. And lastly, the objective, the motivation for the research was that when people talk about anger, what are the tools that language provides them with? Can language in itself be a tool to understand anger as a phenomena better? So this is the background of my work. So very briefly, the questions that I asked of myself was, what is the role of discourse? What is the role of everyday discourse, social interpretations and narratives of anger in the activation of various meanings of anger? What is the information that linguistic features and figurative language like metaphors, what do they reveal about the emotional experience of anger in a particular culture? And can modified linguistic analysis be used as a tool for emotion research? And can it be a good adjunct to quantitative analysis, not to replace quantitative analysis, but for both to act in conjunction and to give a much richer perspective of the emotion, right? So these were some of my research questions, so I'm going to step into the methodology before I go into my findings. So the expression and the experience of anger as narrated by people in their stories was the unit of my understanding of my analysis. And to this effect, I chose to interview 14 men and 12 women, all aged between the age of 22 and 30. And I used snowball purposive sampling as my methodology. Now, one of the things that I introduced in my work is that in my preparation, I found that anger being a moral emotion is hard to talk about because the fear of judgment is very strong. And it was necessary for me to find a method where people would be able to talk about their emotion easily, or it would be comfortable for them to talk about their emotion, this emotion of anger. So towards that effect, I primed the participants with a 1-minute video from the documentary film Gussa. Now, very briefly, what is priming? Priming, of course, is Priming, of course, is a phenomena that is very well researched. And, the priming allows narrators to access their memories while viewing the film clip. So basically what priming does is that it activates various social cognitions. So it's almost as if when participants view this film clip, which is from a documentary film clip called as Gussa, it makes them activate some memories of anger. So this was a deliberate attempt to stoke people's memories and to get into their cognitions, social cognitions of anger. The data in this study consists largely of oral narratives, and these were elicited by detailed conversations using a semi-structured interview with young Indian adults about, the unit of the study, which is the experience and which is the expression and experience of anger. And typically speaking, the data was analyzed deploying the lens of narrative methodology, and I used two methodological constructs, which I will explain. So to begin with, let's first understand what narrative means, right? What is the meaning of the term narrative? Narrative, of course, is where meaning comes from and how experience is shaped and ordered, right? So a better understanding, we need to have a better understanding of narrative as, a methodology, right? So I argue that stories about anger are human interactions, and they're enacted through narrative representations, which is what Murray says. And what do these stories reveal? They reveal aspects of the emotion like precipitants, antecedents, outcomes, coping, beliefs associated with the construct of anger. So in that sense, a narrative can be about many things, but in this thesis, we specifically use narratives as a means to understand how a narrative as a means to understand how stories are shared and spoken about. All right, so let's move further. Here is where I talk about the social linguistic method that I used. William Labov, of course, a very prominent American social linguistic, was prima facie the motivation for my research. William Labov is sort of quite famous for trying to understand the relationship between language and various social constructs like that of race, gender, ethnicity. In his research, he has, and of course his work, he's come up with a structural analytical method by which he uses to analyze data or basically spoken texts, right? So as per William Labov, any raw text, for example, a conversation between you and me, which becomes raw text, can be organized in the form of 6 clauses. So according to Labov, the speaker, the narrator or the speaker, usually has an abstract, which is the theme or the summary of the story, which is, why am I telling you this story? So why am I talking to you about this particular topic is called the abstract. Then the narrator uses time, place, person, and the behavioral situation, which is called the orientation. So the narrator orients us, the listener, to things like, this is the time that the story occurred. These were the persons involved. These were the places involved. And this was a situation that was taking place. And then, of course, the story becomes interesting to the listener only when the narrator introduces what is called as a complicating action. So something that complicates. So what does that mean? So for example, when the narrator says, and this happened, and that happened, and that happened, and that happened, it keeps you hooked into the story, right? So this is called as the complicating action, where the narrator introduces the story in the form of a series of events. Now, is the listener just going to sit and be engaged by a story where there is a theme, there's a place, person, and time, and there are a series of events? Ultimately, the listener wants to know okay, why are you telling me the story? What is the story really about, right? And that was the most important part of my research, which is called as the evaluation. Okay. Now, so what, or what is the point of this story is conveyed through what is called as an evaluation, which I found plentiful in my data. And that was the main part of that was the main point of the analysis. So some two other elements of the Labovian theory are what is called as the resolution and the coda, which is finally the narrator finds a way to resolve the story or it remains unresolved towards the end. And coda is when finally the narrator ends and returns the floor back to the listener, right? So I will explain this through analyzing a piece of one of my narratives. So for example, this is a piece from one of the interviews that I took. So the narrator, and I'm the listener in this case, says, like I said in the first video, if you remember, I told you that I showed my participants a video. It reminded me of a corporate scenario. So, the first video corporate scenario is the orientation. The narrator is talking about a particular corporate scenario or a video. But I mean, that especially when you're working in a certain organization of any sorts, it doesn't have to be work, it could be family. Again, more and more orientation, I'm getting place, I'm getting work, I'm getting family, right? Now, as you can see, the narrator introduces a complicating action, which is that, where you see the other person has a superiority, he has the right to command. And maybe I haven't given him that right, but he has the power somehow. So one of the things that I found in my research is that it's not neatly possible to organize raw text into the clausal structure that Labov has proposed. Like, this is definitely the abstract, this is the orientation, this is the complicating action. And maybe there's a cultural reason behind that, which was quite interesting. So then the narrator complicates this entire story by further saying that, if you stand up for yourself and you say something, you might just end up getting that person into, a scheme against you and put you into trouble. So here the narrator is basically talking about anger in the workplace largely. And eventually goes on to say that, you don't really express your anger. It's all bottled up inside. So now it's all bottled up inside is the evaluation, because this is narrator bringing his or her perspective. Basically, the narrator is trying to say that in a corporate scenario, it's difficult for everybody to express their anger, especially if because there's a hierarchy, there's superiority, and it's all bottled up inside. So in order to be able to come to this very important point, the narrator has to take us through this dramatic sequence of events and places and times for us to reach that, right? And that's the beauty of anger narratives, that the clausal structure, the analysis, the clausal structure of all of the narratives obtained by me showed a repetition of lots and lots of evaluations. And eventually I only chose the evaluated clause as the unit of analysis rather than other clauses, because I realized through my work that anger as an emotion motivates people to communicate their intention through many such structures. The overarching structure is one of the evaluation clause. And under the evaluation clause, I found many, many interesting units like metaphors and similes and folk idioms and swear words, some of which I will talk to you about a little later. But this is just a brief understanding of how the Labovian analysis works. Now, so what is evaluation, right? Why am I choosing evaluation? Why am I not just focusing on place, person, and time? What is evaluation? What makes evaluation as a clause very interesting? So evaluation draws on varieties of ways of suggesting meaning and significance of the events in a narrative. So the narrator just does not want to tell you the story that this happened and this happened. They also want to tell you, but this is what this means to me. And in that in the search of that meaning, that you learn so much about the emotion of anger, right? And attempt to bring the listener's attention to the point of the story. Now, we found that the Labovian method was not completely adequate because the culture that we are in lends a very unique perspective. And in order to make sure that I was being, I was completely justifying the cultural structures that emerge, I also used another method of analysis, which is, of course, the work of my supervisor, Professor Nair. And so therefore, to bring in the cultural knowledge of the listener to the process of making inferences, we use the model proposed by Dr. Rukmini Bhaya Nair. So to put it very simply, if you go back to the structure, we talk about the coda. So for example, if you and I are talking, and suppose I want to end this conversation and I say, Shalini, I think I'm done. And why don't you let me know if there are some questions? So this is me ending my story and handing the floor back to Shalini so that, I'm indicating to Shalini that, Shalini, I'm done. You can take over. So this typically occurs at the end of a story. But narrators who are very creative narrators, they like to stop the story proper at many, many points in time as they speak. But in order for them to stop and speak, they often do that in the form of folk theories or lay conceptualizations, where they are basically theorizing about anger and theorizing about emotions. And these we proposed are, from Dr. Nair's inferential model, is called as mini-codas. So you stop the story in between and you ponder over the meaning of all of this in the form of a folk story or a lay generalization. So what we understood is that narratives demand codas, but not just at the end, but also at places where narrators feel that they still need to say something extra. They need to convey something more, something specific, while about the story of anger. And this usually occurs in the form of cultural wisdom, which they impart to the listener, which I will share with you a little later. Okay. So for example, a simple example of a normal coda is, for example, so this narrator is telling me about the red light and how she's irritated with it. And finally, towards the end, she says, after this interview, I hope I'll get the edited. And I think all the answers, I'm not getting all the answers right now. So she's returning back the floor to me and she's urging me to ask more questions, right? So this is a normal coda. Okay. But example of a mini coda. So this particular narrator is talking about anger and the social phenomena and society, and then stops the story in the middle and talks about the phoenix bird and says, Phoenix was a legendary bird. Khair, uski ek theory hai. Phoenix was a bird that had a long life, and towards the end of its life, the phoenix, and then he gives the entire theory of the phoenix. And then he stops and then he says, so मेरा ये है कि the mighty phoenix एक छोटी सी लाइन ही है. I rise from the ashes of the grave set to destroy me, and I emerge stronger, powerful, glorious, and victorious. मेरा ये मानना that there has to be a sense of transformation, a sense of resurrection. Meaning that the narrator is trying to communicate that anger only becomes useful, or anger is an important emotion when, because of the emotion that you've had, there is, because of working through that emotion, you've had a sense of transformation and resurrection. So this is very pertinent cultural knowledge and information that we are getting because we are looking for this specifically. And so anger as an emotion, it seems, motivates people to stop their story of their personal story of their emotion and to give larger cultural wisdom, right? Okay. So now I'll move on to some of the more crucial findings of my thesis. And then I'll spend more time talking about the findings which are interesting, like the metaphors and folk theories that I spoke about anger. So the broad findings are that narrators seek to comment on the emotion of anger. They just don't want to tell us that I got angry because of this. These are the reasons why I get angry, but they want to comment. And that is the narrative privilege, and that is the nudge. That is what a narration. That is what the power of the narration is. That it nudges you to comment as a third person on the emotion of anger, even though you're the first person experiencing that emotion, and especially through the broad element of evaluation. And evaluation proved to be a measure of the flow of narrative. Narrative. One of the things that we learn about which I learned about as I did my work, was that largely the social construction of anger is that it's a negative emotion. But you also have narrators who talk about anger in other ways, like the fact that anger motivates, it pushes, it also then, in that sense, has a positive impact. The Labovian analysis of the evaluation clause led to a profuse presence of various grammatical devices like negation, modality, intensification, repetitions, which I'm not going to talk about. Each of these items and elements have a significance. If there are any questions about it, I'll answer it later. So apart from the various grammatical and lexical syntactic devices that I found some very interesting metaphors, idioms, folk theories, and of course, code switching. So one of the things, of course, is that India is in the Indian subcontinent is bilingual. Most of us are bilingual. So switching between two languages is common for us. And because we are bilingual, it's just easier sometimes to explain things in a language which is closer to your heart, where you feel that I can use this language to explain this better. And code switching is not uncommon. That is, switching between languages is not really uncommon. But an analysis of where all the code switches happen between the languages was quite interesting, because it showed that there are some places where narrators feel that they need to explain things a bit more about anger, and they switch from English to Hindi, or Hindi to English, or even their native language, to be able to explain certain things. And all of these findings eventually led me to create what is an intuitive and inductive anger lexicon, which is not a dictionary of any kind, but it basically reflects the local knowledge which is rooted in the culture through which narrators make sense of the emotional experiences. So a study like mine reveals how language has a very essential role to play in the narratives of emotions. So I'll go on to some of my findings. I'll just spend about 10 minutes, and then we can take any questions if we have any. Okay. So now metaphors are very, very common, and anger metaphors are extremely common. So there's nothing new about anger metaphors. And we all know the work of Lakoff and Kovesh, who largely did the work in the area of anger metaphors. And anger is the heat of the fluid inside the container is supposed to be, the famous container metaphor, metaphor. So I'll spend a minute on trying to explain this to everybody. So on the basis of the work of Lakoff and Kovesh, they found that a large number of expressions around anger can largely be subsumed under this conceptual metaphor, which is, what is anger? Anger is the heat of a fluid inside a container. So if you look at the various expressions that I was able to cull out from my work, it was, for example, when narrators say it keeps getting heated up, or they say that ekdam para chad jata hai, which is, para of course is mercury, or to gussa mein pee jata hu, so I drink the anger, seething with anger, I'll keep that thing burning inside me. So you see the reference just to seething, burning, heated, consumed with anger. anger settles down and it's gone, which means that the container is not going to explode and the anger is not going to come out, but it's sort of like gone down in the container, right? The heat of the emotion has gone down. Surge of emotion, right? So anger is the heat of the fluid. So it causes the emotion to surge up from inside of you. It causes the blood to boil inside of you. Again, boiling. Emotion is drained away, shaking with anger. It's all bottled up inside, which is of course a mini-coda. It helps me to clear up the steam. I apne aap hi main thanda ho jata hu, which is I become chilled down on my own. So the heat of the fluid no longer has the heat. So it's sort of like starting to become cool. Anger it's like a bomb ready to explode, but it cannot explode, right? So I keep on piling it up. So these are some examples of a typical container metaphor. Now, surprisingly, usually research reveals to us and has explained to us that idioms and metaphors eventually become entrenched, and we repeatedly use the same expressions. We don't necessarily go out there and try to get creative expressions because it's just easier to pick up, like I'm seething with anger. It's just easier to insert that into a sentence. And so creative metaphors are very rarely found. And it was interesting for me, therefore, to find some creative metaphors in the data. So for example, one of my narrators spoke about freezing it in your mind. So freezing anger in this person's mind. You freeze your anger, but you feel it in your heart. So creating polarities between the heart and the mind. And anger can be in two places. And in those two places, it can exist in different forms, which is very interesting. And cold anger. So from the perspective of the container metaphor theory, anger can't really be cold. You can have passive anger, but you can't have cold anger because anger is the heat of the fluid, the substance. So to say that anger is cold, where the narrator is basically referring to anger that's been frozen for years together. And expressions like incubated anger, right? I really cook it, which is that anger is some sort of a fire which is on slow for some time, okay? And another very interesting expression which another narrator had was that aag ko sirf pani se bujhaya ja sakta hai. Fire is only doused with water. So here the reference is that aag is anger and pani is sort of like water, right? So a combination of fire and water as an expression. So this very interesting combination makes it a little creative. So when I say the word creative, I don't necessarily mean that it's new, but it is creative because it goes to show that narrators have made an effort to resource certain things in a way which is very different from the existing expressions that can be used, right? So another narrator compares anger to salt as a flavor and says, if anger is not there, life neeras ho jayegi. Life ke maze mein gussa namak ka kaam karti hai, right? So literal translation would be, if anger is not there, life will become without rasa. In the fun of life, anger works like salt, right? So here, namak or the salt refers to the enjoyment, the experience, the flavor of living. Anger is to life as salt is to flavor, right? So it's such a beautiful expression where anger is necessary. It's the necessary ingredient. Just like salt is necessary to make food flavorful, anger is the necessary ingredient to create rasa, or otherwise life will be neeras. So this is a very creative expression, and that is why you find very few of these in a narrative. But it makes us think. It made me think as to how narrators would want to go, to what lengths would they want to go to speak about this emotion, to sort of like find a way to give their side of their understanding of this emotion. So for example, another narrator talks about my anger drops down. So we've heard of I become chilled, I cool down, I calm down. But, we don't really hear about anger dropping down. So sort of like, so to say that anger was hot initially, when it falls down, it's so like temperature drops. That's how anger sort of like drops. So in that sense, it's quite a creative expression. And lastly, another narrator talks about like you have to tame a mad horse who's been left. So here, mad horse refers to the person who's enraged. Mad has been used instead of wild. So usually you say wild horse, but here the narrator uses mad. So a horse which has gone mad, or a person who's been enraged and tame, this person needs to be brought from wildness to a tractable state, right? To a state which is more controlled, which is probably more sane in that sense. So, so these are the emergence of some very interesting creative metaphors. Now I'll go on to talk about folk theories. Okay, so I'll take a minute to. I'd like to take a minute to first explain what I mean when I say folk theories, right? What does it mean for me to talk about folk theories? So Averill, of course, the great researcher who was very famous for his anger diary studies, said that folk theories help us make the world comprehensible. Anger is a construct, and anger is. The author says that the emotional syndrome is a theoretical entity, and it goes beyond the individual and the existing, and it is represented through various rules, representations in people's behavior based on folk theories, right? So, so here is the beauty that. That the power of the emotion of anger is such that it is brought out through the linguistic creativity of narrators. Anger is such an emotion that it moves people to talk. And so people are not just using words and grammatical units and metaphors, but they're also using their own personalized local folk theories to help them locate the emotional experience in a socio-cultural context. And so, for example, going back to the folk theories that emerged from the work is for example, and the folk theories don't always have to be about anger, they could be about other things, right? So, for example, people who are really furious with things, they're the stepping stones of change. So that's a very folk theory. So it's not a theory based in science, but it's like a lay generalization that people have. There are people who say the same thing as if they're saying poetry, right? So one of the narrator basically is commenting about someone that she's really angry with, and she stops the narration and would like to say that there are people who like to say things, and they say as if they're saying poetry. And so that's an interesting folk theory. So things like "Duniya kamzor ko hi marti hai," or it takes many muscles to frown and just four, so I choose the whole muscle theory. Then narrators.
Is this also a philosophy that people have? It's like your own philosophy which you have in life.
Yes. So that's why it's called a folk theory. It's it emerges from the culture, and it emerges from lay and simplistic understanding of things. So it may not be put to scientific test, but it shows all the cultural knowledge that I possess. So when we say that anger is bad or anger is good, that is wisdom that is coming from the culture, right, that I live in. Or for example, when someone says ki bina paise ke sab vakil banne wale sab, right? So this narrator is saying it in anger that people are trying to be lawyers but they don't really have the money. That can be the literal translation. But a better way to understand this is, that they want to say more. And because they want to say more, right? And why do they want to say more? So why do they want to make this inference? Why do they want to talk about these social rules? So for example, so much of space is devoted to Should anger be more? Should it be less? Should it be toned down? The rules about anger, in whose presence, where, when can we express anger? Where can you break the rules? Can anger empower? Can anger disempower? And other various rules, right? So in folk theories, you find power, hierarchy, social structures, right? So these are the various ways in which narrators try to use commonsensical and commonly used expressions, which could be conventionalized. They may be something that we've heard repeatedly, but they are aimed at basically talking about a knowledge structure that they have to communicate their thoughts and their feelings, right? Anyway, so I spent a lot of time on talking about my folk theories because I find it very, very interesting, the kind of folk theories that people have shared. And I'll come to the most interesting bit, which is the anger lexicon. So on the basis of all the data that emerged through the evaluative inferences and the structures that I spoke about, we created an entirely inductive lexicon emerging directly from the narrator's stories and categorized them into 4 themes: anger being, anger affect, anger manifestation, and anger judgment. So basically, terms which effectively capture, which capture the descriptive terms and phrases used by narrators to give character to the anger. So how did narrators give character to the anger? So I classified them in a lexicon. And I'll show you the lexicon. Very briefly, what is anger being? Anger being refers to what is anger, according to the narrators. Anger affect is what are the various feeling words, or what are the feelings that arouse anger, or what are the associated anger-like emotional states. Anger manifestation is how is anger shown in behavior, both verbally and non-verbally. And lastly, anger judgment. What are the various judgments and self-assessments that emerge from anger narratives? So I would like to share this. All right. So here is an example of my lexicon. So for example, what is anger, right? What is anger? So for example, people say this anger is inauthentic, mock anger, fake anger. So creating a typology of anger. So people are not just satisfied with saying that I'm angry, I'm irritated, I'm frustrated. They want to talk about the qualitative, individual, idiosyncratic experience of their anger. And which is why they come up with phrases like, oh, but she was showing mock anger, or her anger was fake. So this anger is not really authentic, but it's yet anger. And so another narrator conceptualizes the anger shown by a particular person is aggression plus society. So you see an interesting typology emerges. Now, anger affect, or the various other emotional states associated with anger. So, for example, you have furious rage, which is common, and then you have kaske gussa, or, like literal translation would be tight anger. Now, this is a highly cultural reference, right? Which would be relevant in our culture, right? It may not be as meaningful in other cultures, right? Petrifying, regret. So, of course, there are many such terms. And we find that other emotional terms are also referred to in trying to explain the emotion of anger. So anger manifestation. How does anger manifest in behavior, verbally, non-verbally? So, for example, the terms that are associated with that is the power of aggression, hurting, violence. So people categorize physical anger versus verbal anger, beating, hitting, and of course, many such terms. Biting, right? And lastly, of course, anger judgment or anger assessment, right? So offended, upset, dangerous, unpredictable, completely impulsive, blank. So this is, of course, a very brief idea of the lexicon, that I have shared with you. And I would like to delve a little deeper and spend 5 minutes to just explain to you about, what I meant by these, what I meant by this, so that you have a better understanding of, you have a much better understanding of this. So, what is anger being? Narrators are using descriptive phrases to explain the kind of anger that they may be experiencing, like, for example, extreme anger, complete anger. So the lexicon is reflecting how cultural practices figure in language demonstration. And that sometimes the idea that emotion cannot be separated from the self, which can be used in, which is seen in the use of a phrase by another narrator who uses the phrase human anger. And narrators want to comment about the authenticity, the genuineness of an emotional experience, and they use the term genuine anger. Anger affect, of course, is basically a pool of the various terms that are described. There are various states and feelings associated with anger. Anger manifestation is, of course, terms that mark anger behavior, verbally and non-verbally, which I spoke about. And of course, anger invites sort of like judgment, right? Anger of self or of others invites judgment. So narrators then are making judgments not just about the emotion, but they're making judgments about the gender. They're making judgments about power. They're making judgments about, they're making an assessment about various social constructs over here. So this makes for, one of the things that we propose through our work is that imagine being able to create such an intuitive and inductive, not intuitive, sorry, but an inductive lexicon for various other emotions rooted in the culture that you are in. And what is the kind of rich data that you would get if you were to create such lexicons? And as a therapist, I can tell you that I pay keen attention to what my clients say, but I'm always seeing that where are they situated when they're speaking this, when they're speaking about this, especially about an emotion. And therefore, I find we found that the concept of the anger lexicon is extremely useful because it presents an opportunity for us to see what anger means to me, the meanness of me as a person, as an individual, what anger means to Shalini, and how can we map that through her language, and eventually, maybe what does that tell me about the kind of a person that, hopefully, the kind of a person that I am or someone else is, right? What does it tell me about this person's idea about mental health, family, for example, right? So I'm just sort of like freeballing over here, but yeah. So this was a fantastic piece of work, sort of finding that we had, and I'd like to end, because we have about 5 minutes. I'd like to end by I had many learnings, but some of the most important learnings that I had through my work, and I hope I have been able to communicate that with you, is that this was a first step towards a methodology. This is just, of course, the first nascent step towards a methodology in the field of emotion research in India, which is combining linguistic and thematic analysis and looking at culture. And such an ethno-methodological approach that pays attention to speakers, narratives, and narrative strategies can contribute to the field of emotion research, which is already very rich. The field of emotion research is very enriched by the amount of work that is done. And the experience of anger is so powerful that it exerts an influence over language and social reception. And the power of this emotion is brought out through linguistic creativity. Anger is an emotion that moves people to actually talk. So I will end here. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Srividya. I will just check with Ravi. If there are any questions, just give me a minute. Ravi, are you there?
Ma'am, I'm checking, ma'am. Waiting. No, ma'am, there is no question, ma'am.
So I think they need time to absorb and analyze, comprehend this information. This for me, I must say, I must compliment you. It was very interesting and very much related to psychology, linguistics. We also do here content analysis, and
Yes.
you are actually doing something similar, but much more exhaustive, I must say. So it's a beautiful piece of work on anger. Anger is such a has such diverse multiple emotions, sub emotions in itself. I can really understand, and the way you have analyzed it, I really wish that we could know how you extracted all those things and like more transcript. But yes, time was a constraint here. But as you were wondering that before that, if the audience, it is for me, I think, being from a psychology background, it was clearly understandable. It gave us a new perspective of analyzing this thing, the emotions aspect, the particular perspective which you have taken from a psycholinguistic perspective. And also I didn't know about the Naya's perspective, so this was a new information for me. So thank you so much, Srividya, for giving such a rich information about the emotion and the methodology both. And we would be really glad and grateful if you can share this PPT with us, so we can share with our participants, because not all of them would have been present here at this time.
Sure.
And content like this, we need more time to process.
Sure.
So thank you again for coming here and giving this talk and lecture on your thesis. I hope
My pleasure.
that we have such more sessions on this work, and this is a qualitative piece of work, one of the best qualitative piece of work, I must say.
Thank you, Shalini. Thank you for inviting me. It was indeed very humbling to talk about my experience with my work. Right. Thank you. Thank you. And I hope that there are other questions and you can pass them on to me, and then I will answer them for you. Right. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ravi. So we can end this meeting for today.
Okay,
Thank you
ma'am.
all the participants for attending this session.